Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. It feels like it's been a while since we've done a proper interview after the Best Of series and some of the guest spots and the Red Menace episodes we've released. So we're back to form here, and today we have on Alex Zambito from Southern Catholic Worker, which is a wonderful Instagram page that I've followed for a very long time. That is kind of coming out of the Catholic worker tradition as well as the Marxist tradition and combining those two traditions. And I just always have loved that page and gotten a lot out of it. So it's overdue for me to have Alex on the show and to discuss the intersection of communism and Christianity, you know, and explore the Catholic worker tradition, explore some major figures within the Christian tradition that have been engaged in social justice and revolutionary and liberatory activity. So we cover all of that today. We talk about American Christianity and its relationship with militarism and capitalism. We talk about the connections between the core values of socialism and communism and the core values of Christianity and the message of Jesus Christ. We talk about the necessity of opening your heart and transcending selfish egoism and desire within both the Buddhist and Christian traditions. And we just touch on a lot of fascinating and interesting aspects of the intersection between Christianity and communist socialist politics. So really, really fun conversation that I'm excited to get into. And of course, we'll link to his page, Southern Catholic Worker, in the show notes if people don't already follow it. And as always, if you like what we do here at Rev Left Radio, you can support us directly on patreon.com/Rev Left Radio, link in the show notes, where for only $5 a month, you can get hundreds of backlogged Patreon exclusive episodes, as well as new episodes every single month. And we're doing this new thing on the Patreon where I'm calling it tentatively the Rev Left Situation Room, where when big political news breaks, international or domestic political news, what we started doing is having huge Zoom calls where the Rev Left Patreon community and I jump on a big Zoom call, and we have a facilitator, the wonderful Saya, who helped facilitate our first call to organize the whole thing. And we all are in community discussing this event and making sense of it in real time together. I think it's a really cool way to add a communal dimension, or at least extend the communal dimension of the Rev Left Patreon, which is already communal in nature. And it's, one of the great rewards of my life is to be in contact with all the wonderful supporters of the show and to learn from them and to be in dialogue with them about the big issues. So if you're interested in that at all, it really helps put food on the table for me and Dave and our families. It means the world to us, and it literally allows this show to continue going. We're now 8 years in to Rev Left, believe it or not, and I'm so grateful to be able to be a part of this project and the community that's popped up and emerged around it. It is one of the great rewards of my life. So thank you all to anybody who supports the show. But if you don't want to join Patreon, you don't like the subscription model, you just want to show us some love, we also have a Buy Me a Coffee one-time donation link in the show notes as well, which I know some people prefer to do that way, and that also really, really helps. Just pay the bills and put food on the table and get us through month to month. So thank you to everybody who supports the show. And if you don't have money, it's hard times, we get it. You can like the show, leave a positive review, share it with friends and family. And those are all really meaningful ways to help the show grow and extend our reach. All right, without further ado, here is my interview with Alex Zambito, who is the creator of the Southern Catholic Worker page on Christianity, communism, Catholic worker, and so much more. Enjoy.
Alex Zambito. I run the Instagram account Southern Catholic Worker. I also live at the New York City Catholic Worker at St. Joseph's House when I'm a volunteer. Help out on the soup line. I guess my political, just to give a quick idea of my political identification, generally identify as a communist. That's about me.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, before we started recording, I had mentioned that your page, Southern Catholic Worker, is one of my favorite on Instagram and has been for a very long time. So obviously, if people listening are not following you, they absolutely should. It puts out really consistently good stuff, and I love, and it's no surprise to longtime Rev Left listeners, I love the infusion of sincere, liberatory religiousness and the religious impulse and that whole side of the human condition into the political sphere. I think it always has been relevant, and it will continue to be relevant. Most people on Earth have some sort of religious orientation, and if communists and people that are interested in political organizing and education and revolution want to be taken seriously, they need to at least not be dismissive of it. Of course, I have my own sort of spiritual or religious inclinations, but have always explored others, and I think your page does a really good job of maintaining a really principled approach to both religion and politics, which I just appreciate. So I guess before we get into even the first question about your own personal journey, how long has that page been active, and what made you want to start it?
Let's see. So originally I started the page, it was called Southern Marxist when I first began it. That was, not sure, probably like maybe a little before the pandemic, so probably like 2019, 2018, something like that. So I started a while ago, but that was like the first iteration of the account. Eventually I got too many guideline or community guideline warnings from Instagram, and that first account got taken down. So I created a second one. I don't know how long it's been on the second one, but that one I renamed to Southern Catholic Worker. I guess the original like impetus to start it was just I was at the time living in Savannah, Georgia. So that's my hometown. And just like not really feeling like there's a whole lot of a political outlet all the time sometimes. And it felt like a good way, starting an Instagram page kind of felt like a good way to be able to learn more about the issue and kind of like about issues, and just like be able to talk to more like-minded people about politics and use that to like help with like, it's good to have like people to bounce ideas off of, especially when you want to talk to more reactionary people in your more immediate surroundings. Yeah. So that was kind of like the original inspiration for why I did it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I've never been to Savannah, Georgia. I've heard it's a beautiful little mid-sized city. Obviously, I live, born, raised, and continue to live and raise my family in Omaha, Nebraska. So another, conservative mid-sized city where the average person that you come in contact is not even really a liberal, but mostly like a center-right, moderate conservative type, which kind of shifts the dynamics of political education, of organizing, etc. And with the smaller city aspect, you just don't have access to as many long-term organizations that have been around, like in places like Chicago and New York City and Seattle and LA, which just creates a little obstacle for organizing in general, and to keep that momentum going and the longevity and the sort of institutional memory and lessons of long-time organizing that occurs in perhaps bigger cities. So, I relate to a lot of that, but we're going to get into a lot of this as we go through this conversation. I'm definitely interested in the Catholic worker aspect, which we'll get into in a couple questions here, but just kind of just orienting people to you as a human being. Can you just tell us a bit about your own journey, kind of how you came into the Catholic worker tradition and how your political and spiritual commitments developed over time?
Yeah. So I guess for me, I mean, this is kind of like not a very profound answer, but I think it's kind of true for most people, even though they don't say it, is that I think like my original like religious background and like why I'm Catholic is because I was raised Catholic. I know it's not like it's a very not profound answer, but it's I think kind of true in that I think like a lot of our religious identity just kind of gets formed with like just how we're raised. Like my parents took me to church and I went to Sunday school and that sort of stuff. So like that's kind of I think like where the original like religious impetus comes from, but also I think people, and this is I'll talk about it a little bit more maybe later. But like I think most people, their experience like with religion is large part just kind of like the first experience with being in like a broader community. So I know for me, I grew up with like in a relatively small town, like a little outside of Savannah, and my parish was pretty small, and just like everyone kind of in the town like getting to know each other. Like that's where I would hang out with my friends. Like everyone kind of knew each other at mass. So I think like a big part of it is that like church provides a large part of like community cohesion for a lot of people. And I think that's kind of like something that brings people, like at least definitely brought me back to being in faith, like to my current like faith identity. And I know like growing up, something that I had as a child was like my family had like I had like a nanny and a papa. That's what we called them. Like basically just an elderly couple that lived across town that kind of took care of us, and they would take us to the church. Like they were also in charge of cleaning our church, so I spent a lot of time with them, like cleaning the church, and just kind of being around the church. And also just like, developing a relationship with them. They were probably two of the closest people I ever had in my whole life. And I think that's kind of true for a lot of people, is that a lot of times, like us coming back to our faith, or not, for me, it's coming back to my faith, but for us, like our faith experience is like really shaped by these relationships we have like along the way. Like your faith is something you don't necessarily experience by yourself. It's something you experience in community with other people. And for me, that's kind of like a big aspect about also what brought me to the Catholic Worker. So just in my own little faith journey, I originally, like I said, was raised Catholic. My parish was, even though I liked it, was also a little bit more conservative. I think for a long time, that was like pretty alienating for me, is that it's just something I didn't really relate to, a lot of those aspects of it. So I spent a long time, especially like probably around high school through college, where I was kind of broken away from the church. I was probably more like Richard Dawkins style, like Reddit atheist,
Yeah.
which is a little bit what I consider now. I think what kind of brought me back to the church was just exploring other faiths too, and kind of like how they interpreted God, like reading more into like Buddhism and Islam and other religions, and how they like interpret the spirituality and how they think about God, like kind of helped me bring me back to the church. Or help me bring me back towards religion. And then I think once I started reading more into Catholicism and learning about these different strands in the church that, I think oftentimes the mainstream hierarchy of the church tries to hide, was very, a big reason why I kind of came back. And as I said, like what brought me to like the Catholic Worker, was just kind of like I said, that sense of like community and being with other people. Like there's just the the Catholic Worker is like now kind of taking on my like religious community, and just kind of living with other people was sometimes can be difficult, but also just like being there for each other. I know Dorothy Day, who's the founder of the Worker, said like, the way we get through this world is through community and love. That's not an exact quote, but kind of the gist of it. And that's kind of like that was like a big deal for me coming to the Worker. Then also, I think it was just kind of a way for me to integrate like a lot of the values I had, even as like a Marxist or a communist, into like my life, like in how I was actually living. Because like we, here we like live together, live in a community, try to at least do the best we can to serve people who need it, and also just kind of like breaking away from capitalism. Like now, one thing I hated about things was having like a 9 to 5 and kind of getting away from that, like the rat race of all of that is also like a very good aspect for me. It kind of allows me to more live out the religious and political values I have of like, give, like Jesus said, give away your possessions and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that's kind of like what brought me here.
Yeah, and I think that ethical foundation is essential to any sincere religious life, whether it is Islam or Christianity or, in my personal case, Buddhism. In Buddhism, the Eightfold Path is heavily ethical. Like you can't extract the process of enlightenment or waking up in the Buddhist tradition from that ethical foundation. And I think the best of Christianity has always had that service orientation, that ethical foundation. It goes back to the core message, the beating heart of Jesus's entire life, and the message that he put out into the world that still resonates 2,500 years later. I won't go too deep into my own personal connections, but when I was around 13, 14 years old, I grew up in a very I would say atheistic, but in the sense not that there was a rejection of anything, just that there was a complete absence of any discussion whatsoever about religion or God or anything. There wasn't even a belief. There wasn't even like an anti-belief. It just wasn't present. But around my early teens, I had some friends that went to a Catholic school, and I got interested in it, and I converted at age 13 to Catholicism. And I don't think I was mature enough to engage with the religion at the level that I needed to, and I eventually, as you did, fell into a new atheist phase in my late teens, early 20s. But the thing about the new atheist phase is that it's like irony, in that it just dismantles, right? It just rejects, it just sees through, it just destroys it doesn't build anything. It doesn't create anything. It doesn't even create community. In fact, the communities are mostly online and pretty fucking toxic, and there's no way to build anything constructive or meaningful out of the ashes. It's just ashes. And so I think once you go through that phase, it's a part of a maturing phase for sure, an intellectual developmental phase, and then a return to the religious impulse, which is still there, and rediscovering the spiritual or religious tradition at a higher level, having left it and then come back to it, I think is an important part of a lot of people's process. So yeah, I think that's really interesting and resonates with a lot of people. But I am interested in the Catholic worker. I've never, as far as I understand, over 8 years of Rev Left, I don't think I've ever done an episode about the Catholic worker movement. So can you kind of talk about what it is, what, I guess you kind of touched on what resonated with you about it, but maybe some of the history of it and maybe its presence in the American South.
So the Catholic Worker originally was founded during the Great Depression, I believe in 1933. Originally, it was founded as just kind of like a paper. It was founded by Dorthy Day and Peter Morin. Dorothy Day was actually originally a communist and was very involved with like communist and like suffragette organizing in her early life, and eventually converted to Catholicism. And she like looked out and kind of saw like all of this like political organizing that was happening by like socialist, communists, and anarchists and others. And she looked down and was like, well, where's the Catholic leadership? Where's Catholics being involved in this? And that was kind of like her impetus and Peter Morin's impetus for like beginning the paper. And eventually the paper morphed into Houses of Hospitality. So the story that they kind of gets told is that originally just kind of started off, people would come by the paper office that they had on, I think it was on Mott Street, was the original one here in New York. And people would just come up and like asking for coffee, and then so they would give them coffee, and then more people would come by asking for coffee, and just they give them more coffee, and then everyone would just like start hanging out and like talking to each other, and really kind of like getting to know each other, and kind of getting to know the people that they were serving, and that's kind of like where the houses of hospitality really came from, to just like serve the people particularly impacted by the Great Depression. So that's kind of like the impetus for it, and it's been going on pretty much ever since then, like different phases. Dorothy passed away in 1980. I'm not sure when Peter Morin passed away, but it was, I think, sometime like maybe the 1950s. But yeah, and it's still going today. We're still on the Lower East Side. We have two houses, St. Joseph's House and Mary House. St. Joseph's House mainly serves men. Mary House mainly serves women. But like we just do run the houses like with the soup kitchens in the like out of our kitchen, so guys come in, get to like sit down, have a nice meal, get to like talk to each other, because a big aspect of the Catholic worker too is personalism. So kind of getting to know the people the people we're serving on an individual basis, kind of getting to know their like what their lives are like and where they came from, and the situation they're in. So and I think that's kind of like the main foundations for what the Catholic worker is, and it's mainly devoted to like the works of mercy. So that means like helping the poor, serving, like helping the orphan, the widow, visiting people in jail, like those sorts of things. I kind of consider the works of mercy. That's like kind of the main aspect of what we try and do.
Is there a political line or a vague ideological orientation, or is it just the message of Christ applied in the social realm? Does it stay away from kind of like having a coherent or specific politic?
I think it's there's not like a party line or anything like that. But there's definitely a general like political orientation. I think it's mainly like identified as like an anarchist like community and ideology, but I think mainly the main way I can put it is just like it's very focused on direct action. Like you see that there's a problem and you try and address the problem and fix it. So you see there's hungry people, so you just feed them. Like pretty, I think so. In that way, it's pretty simple, but like also like I said, big emphasis on like trying to build community and getting to know like big like focus on community, and also just like living among the oppressed and like people and living among the poor and kind of taking on their condition. So like a big part of the workers' philosophy is called like voluntary poverty. which obviously kind of derives from Jesus and like St. Francis and others, the idea of giving up your possessions and then going to serve the poor. And I think like the way personally I interpret it is kind of more like, is in the sense of like not being attached to like worldly possessions and kind of giving them up and living in community with others.
Yes, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's serving the people, really. It's like wherever there's a need, there's human need, we're going to go out and meet it. And it has, an anarchist history. Dorothy Day, it has a sort of communist history. Are there just like well-intentioned, good-hearted liberals that are a part of the movement as well, that don't necessarily have radical politics, but just like the Christian dimension of service?
Yeah, I mean that kind of like comes to. I think a lot of people don't, when they come, they kind of just think of it as like this place where I go do like volunteer work. But I think also part of the worker is trying to like build consciousness on that it's not just like, you don't just come to the soup kitchen like once a week, do your thing and then leave and then go back to doing whatever you're doing. It's about trying to integrate all the things, all those things like into your life as you go through the world too. So, I mean, the big thing that like liberation theologians say, and I think that we say here pretty often, saying like Christ in the face of the poor. So like, and that's just how it's just like an orientation you have to take, like you're in your everyday life, like seeing Christ in the face of the oppressed. And I think part of that's like trying to struggle for a better world for them, or struggle for like a better world for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And also struggling like with them. I think that's like the biggest thing I hope that we like trying to emphasize is that like we are not just like giving things, we're like traveling with people. We're like we're accompanying people through their lives and trying to help them, and also like trying to be with them, not just like trying to like here's your sandwich later and like see you later, like not gonna talk to you again or whatever, like it's trying to take it away from being purely just a service thing, which is I think important, but also kind of turning into a solidarity thing. I think that's a big part of like what the message is, and hopefully what people get from like coming here to volunteer.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think what the Catholic worker and other iterations of service-oriented, liberation-oriented Christianity offer is this strain, this very real tradition, going all the way back to Jesus Christ himself, of serving other people, serving the meek, the sick, the poor, rejecting consumerism, rejecting nationalism, militarism, violence, which so much of American Christianity has been warped into in this country, and we'll get to that. But my position as a Marxist on religion is not that we should reject it, sort of simplistically and embrace atheism. I think we need to engage with it dialectically. There are some Marxists who are just atheists, and that's fine. Maybe they don't have a religious community and aren't interested in that aspect of the world. But there are many, many, many Marxists around the world who are in religious communities, who do have a religious faith of some sort. And the proper dialectical move is to go into these strains that exist within every religious and spiritual tradition, engage with them deeply, learn from them, and then help develop them. Pull out this strain of the Catholic worker within Catholicism. Anybody listening knows the Catholic Church has plenty of problems, plenty of sites that we can critique it from a Marxist perspective, and Marxists do that. But there is also this beautiful element that gets tossed out with the bathwater if you just reject the entirety of it. And I think what you're doing is the absolute, best thing that somebody coming out of the Catholic tradition who is also a communist or a Marxist or a socialist can possibly do. And I think, dialectically developing these strains and carrying these traditions forward is the right and most principled sort of path for people who are in religious communities or have religious backgrounds, rather than just a straight up negation of the entire thing. So food for thought. But I kind of want to zoom out from the Catholic worker and even maybe from Catholicism in and of itself and kind of talk about Christianity more broadly. Like, what does, Christianity mean to you? What about the message of Jesus resonates with you? I know you've touched on it, but maybe you can go a little deeper in what does Christianity have to offer people in our very secular, very skeptical, postmodern age?
I think the most important thing, and Jesus says this in the Gospels, is the two most important rules are to love your God above all, to love God above everything else, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that, at least in terms of like how we live our daily lives, that second part is incredibly important. And that's kind of like where, like, I would say all of my, mostly all my political beliefs essentially stem from, is loving your neighbor as yourself. Like, part of communism is that you believe that everyone is entitled to like basically the bare necessities of life, just based on the fact that they're human, that they're people. And same thing with like being Christian. I believe that that people deserve to flourish and have a good life just because they're human, not because they like did anything, just because they are created by God, just like I was. One of my favorite phrases, actually, something John Brown said a lot, and we'll talk about him more, is that God is not any respecter of persons. And by that, he means this comes from the Acts of the Apostles, where St. Peter is basically saying that, like, the word of God is for everybody. God doesn't care. He doesn't give a shit, like, where you're from, like, if you're a Gentile or a Jew or whatever. He just cares that you're a person and he created you. And that he believes that God believes that, like, you are entitled, you deserve to, like, have, he loves you and wants you to, like, have a good life. And as humans, you know, what am I going to do, disagree with God about that? Not really. So that's like a big part of the aspect for me, just that one simple line. But then also just like more aspects of like Jesus's story. I think he really, in Jesus's life, he emphasized or kind of epitomized more than most other, and pretty much anyone else I can think of, like solidarity with the oppressed. So first, like, one thing you'll get talking about theology is that Jesus was the Son of God. Like, at least, you know, Christians, we believe Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus could have been born to anybody. He could have been born to Herod. He could have been born to like a royal person, a Roman, to anybody he wanted to be. But instead he was born to a poor peasant family in Palestine, who were forced to flee as refugees. And I think that's like a big aspect of it. God decided to, when he decided to incarnate himself, made himself a poor person and decided to live among the oppressed. And Jesus does that throughout the rest of his life and the rest of his ministry. He says, like, tells people, you need to give away your possessions to come join me. And when they traveled when him and the apostles were traveling around, they largely depended on the providence of God and other people's, like, you know, goodwill towards them to take care of them, to make sure they got food. And I think that's just like, and then obviously, you know, the end of Jesus' life, where he is obviously crucified. And in my view, large part he was crucified because he stood with the oppressed. He stood with the people that the temple authorities and the Romans didn't like. And that's another big part about Jesus, is that he didn't care. Like, going back to that respecter of persons, the Pharisees, who were like the religious authorities in ancient Israel, were kind of viewed themselves as above, like holier than thou, above everyone else. And Jesus is like, no, y'all like don't care about the poor. Y'all like, you know, basically oppress people all the time. And then that's like, and, you know, y'all are just basically kind of full of shit. And he basically would tell them that to their face. And that's kind of like probably one of the reasons why, or it is probably the main reason why he was crucified. And that also kind of goes back to his actions in the temple, where he flips the table and drives out the moneylenders. Jesus was so in solidarity with the oppressed, and that pretty much the one time in the entire Bible, the entire New Testament, where he uses violence is when he sees that these people are just like abusing and oppressing and exploiting poor people in the house of God, in his Father's house. And so like all these things kind of add up to just someone who I view as who is in complete solidarity with oppressed people, even when he could have put himself in a much easier situation. Yeah, and also a big part, another aspect I really love about Jesus is he is motivated, kind of like what Chase said, like a revolutionary. He is motivated by like a deep sense of like love for other people. And even the people who oppressed him, even the Pharisees. Jesus loved the Pharisees and wanted them to change. He would just tell them, you're wrong, to their face, and I hope and I pray that you get better, and I pray that you like change your ways. And that was kind of like, and that's also like, I think, a big aspect about Christianity, about Jesus' story that really resonates with me, is just like trying the act of like loving your enemies even when they're very difficult to love, and striving to make a better world to where they're no longer able to oppress other people. And that's something like one of my favorite people in history is Paulo Freire. He has a very kind of similar idea where like the oppressors, through their actions of oppressing other people, also dehumanize themselves. By dehumanizing other people, they dehumanize themselves. And by struggling for a better world where everyone gets to have all of their needs met and people aren't oppressing others, you are also helping them. And that's like how you can express your love for them, taking away their ability to oppress other people. So like with Elon Musk, like the biggest, one of the best ways you can show your love for Elon is to create a world where he's not able to like act like a huge like oppressive dork all the time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so even that, like trying to love your enemy and create a better world even for them. And then I think the way that kind of like can resonate with people today is that I think a lot of people are disillusioned with our kind of like very materialistic, and I mean that in a non-Marxist sense of materialistic like world we live in, where everything's kind of just about like consumption and consuming things and like looking out for number one, like looking out for yourself, and in a lot of ways under capitalism, like obviously screwing other people over. And I think Jesus offers a message of like actually caring for other people and trying to build a better world for them, for your own good and for their own good. And I think that's kind of like why I still see like even young people kind of coming back towards religious spaces, is that they have been kind of disillusioned with the world that like secular neoliberalism has offered us.
Yes.
And, yeah.
Yeah, it's like taking out the sacred dimension. It's flattened everything. It's flattened the mystery. It's commodified the natural world. It's commodified relationships between people. And we call this scientific and rational progress, but it's so one-sided. There are kernels of progress within that. The development of science and technology and medical advancements. That's all the good parts of this development, but it's packaged in this broader sort of just flattening, desacralized element that reduces everything to a price tag. And, you were talking about the sort of the dialectics of dehumanization, that when you dehumanize another, you simultaneously and inexorably dehumanize yourself. Your relation to life and to the other is brought low by your own dehumanization of the other. The slave is dehumanized and the slave master is dehumanized in that dialectical relationship. And the irony of socialism, the irony of communism, is that it would actually create a world where rich and powerful people would be happier, where they wouldn't be alienated from the rest of the world by their insane wealth, where they wouldn't be completely driven forward by their competitive greed, where they could live in a world where they could set their ego aside for a second and not be driven relentlessly forward by this egoic need to hoard and consume and dominate. And so communism would actually, like you mentioned Elon Musk, like it would create a better world for everybody involved. And I don't think we should lose sight of that aspect, that deep love for all humanity, that we're trying to build a world that's even better for the people that in this iteration are absolutely pretty, whatever, sociopathic, antisocial, etc. So I think we always have to keep that in mind. But I love what you're saying about Jesus, and I think this also relates deeply to the Buddha and Buddhism, which is this loving your neighbor as yourself, this overcoming of selfishness, this overcoming of egoic self-concern, and this radical compassion and sense of non-separation from the other that emerges when one is able to transcend that small egoic prison of relentless self-concern and the sort of bland narcissism that emerges from egoic, seeing the world through the lens of the ego. And capitalism and consumerism and competition and get yours and get your bag and, shine and try to become famous and high status and successful. This is just an ego game. And it's ultimately incredibly empty. The people that win that game, the people that amass all the wealth and all the fame and all the status, they're miserable people, because they're driven forward by a sort of insatiability. Once you start seeking power and wealth and status and success, it's never enough. Elon Musk has all the power and all the money any human being could reasonably ask for. He still just wants to be liked. He still wants people just to laugh at his jokes, and that insecurity destroys him because money can't buy that. Only community and being real and in embedded community with others can afford you that depth of social relationship where you feel totally secure, because you're surrounded by people that love you for who you are, not because of how much money you have or the access that you can give them. So I always talk about in my spiritual practice, and I'll shut up after this, and I would love to hear your thoughts on any of this. But in my spiritual practice, I kind of frame it as try to cultivate the mind of the Buddha, right? A calm, non-attached, non-desirous mind resting in awareness, and cultivate the heart of the Christ. This wide open, loving, unconditionally loving approach to the world. It's not easy, right? Even the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, it's actually impossible for the ego, because it is unthinkable, let alone achievable, that the ego could love somebody else as much as it loves itself. The ego, even when it's self-loathing and inwardly hateful, is obsessed with itself. And so the prospect of really obsessing about the well-being of another person as much as you obsess about your own well-being, your own desires, your own moment-to-moment wants, it's unthinkable. So the only way you could actually fulfill that command of loving your neighbor as yourself is to begin to transcend that egoic prison. And on the cross, when Jesus is being crucified and he looks up into the sky and says, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." He is practicing radical, extreme, selfless compassion, even for the people driving nails through his body. And that is a spiritually profound, and I always have found it a deeply moving thing to reflect upon.
Yeah, I think I want to just touch on that one thing you mentioned about like people having, the wealthy having like this insatiable desire, because that's like a very common thread that you'll like hear like with the early church fathers, like St. Basil, who's one of my favorites. He would just kind of talk about is like all of these people are just like, as soon as you get one thing, okay, now you want more. As soon as you get another thing, now you want more than that. And it's just like a constant, and that's, we see that reflected in like in capitalism. You kind of like constantly need to grow. He has one sermon where he's talking about the parable of the man who like tears down his barns to basically the story is that a wealthy like farmer or something has a barn, and then he ends up like having too many goods to put in the barn, so he tears down the barn and puts up a new barn. But little does he know that at the end of that, as soon as he's about to build the new barn, like God takes his life, and all of a sudden he's dead, and now he has no use for that other barn. And he's kind of talking about how useless it is to kind of be constantly worried about accumulation. As soon as you've got one thing, you want more, and as soon as you got more, you need more. And it's like he says, if you have trouble finding a place to store your stuff, you have plenty of storage places in the bellies of the poor. Just give those things away. Instead, you'd rather just like put them in a warehouse somewhere.
Yeah, profound. And yeah, Buddhism totally aligns with that. With the more you desire, the more you strengthen the machinery of desiring, and it's never, ever, ever enough. And and I think that's the root of so much unhappiness. And even though you and I and many people listening, we're not rich, we still have, because we are socially conditioned to have this wanting. Like we're never quite fulfilled. We never quite arrive at peace, inward peace. We always want more. If I could just get that relationship, if I could just get that job, if I could just get that amount of money, I would be finally happy. And then you get that thing, and all of a sudden you find yourself wanting the next thing, looking over its shoulder to see what else you can get. And it's that very process of desiring that does create so much misery and is never, ever, ever satiated ultimately. And so we have to reject that whole apparatus, and that comes with the ego, that comes with constant wanting, and that comes with a radical rejection, as hard as it is because we are so embedded in this society, but a radical rejection of consumerism and trying to find what that would mean in our lives. We have to provide for ourselves and our families for sure, but I find myself with excess stupid shit that I don't want, that is an albatross around my existential neck. And that I know that I would live a much happier life if I had much fewer things and I had much more relationship, right? And that's ultimately, it speaks to our nature as social beings. But yeah, so I want to move on here, and I want to you've mentioned John Brown, and I know that John Brown is a big influence for you, and for great reason. And you mentioned St. Francis earlier and a few others in this conversation. I'm wondering if you could talk more about who have been some of the most formative political and religious influences in your life, thinkers, activists, saints, writers, and maybe, how they have impacted your worldview. You can take this question in any direction.
Yeah, so I mentioned John Brown. John Brown is my favorite person in history, probably. Just because for me, John Brown really exemplifies the example of kind of like solidarity with the oppressed because not only did he like basically give his life to try to end slavery, his approach was entirely influenced by his study of Black people, Black culture, and Black resistance. So like he was really inspired by like slave revolts. So like Nat Turner, the Haitian Revolution, he was really inspired by all of those things. And then also when he established his like home up in North Elba where he's buried, he basically created that community as a place for escaped enslaved people or just Black people in general to come and like live and truly try and see like create a truly integrated society. And like unlike pretty much even the abolitionists of his age, he interacted with other people of other races on complete social equality. So like there are stories of people going to visit his household, and then he's got like Black people just sitting at the table having dinner with them, and they're all like, "Wow, this is weird. Like, I've never experienced this before."
Mm-hmm.
And he just like, he just didn't he didn't give a fuck. He was like, I believe Black people are equal. I don't give a shit what you think. And if you like try, if you disagree with me or you try and discriminate against Black people in my presence, I'm basically just gonna like tell you you're wrong and that God is upset at you. And that's kind of like what he did throughout his life. And then also not even just his approach to with just Black people, it extended to other people. So John Brown, if you read stories about his life in even like Kansas and in like frontier territory, his like relationships with indigenous people and indigenous tribes were always kind of like reciprocal. They're always mutually beneficial. And he like lived with them as like a good neighbor. Like that was like kind of his biggest thing. He would like allow like indigenous people to like stay on his land if they're like traveling somewhere. He would like give them supplies, like that sort of stuff. So he tried to live with like complete reciprocity with the other people around him, and then also with women. So like he believed John Brown when he created that provisional constitution before he was going to attack Harper's Ferry, in that it gives everyone rights regardless of race or gender. So he was in the 1860s, he's a man, or in 1850s, he's a man supporting basically women's right to vote. And if you like hear stories about his like family life, men would do as much of the caretaking work, like clean dishes, cook food, just as much as any of the women in his household. So all those things are just like very important for me with John Brown, is that just not only just like his actions, but like where the inspiration for that came from. It came from like actually like complete identification and solidarity with oppressed people that he sought to serve. So yeah, that's my little speech on John Brown, who I love.
But before you move on, you talked about his inspiration for behaving that way, this egalitarian-minded, feeling that he had. But also, how was he influenced by his faith? Because that was a huge part of his life, right? He saw these sort of beliefs as natural outgrowths of his faith, correct?
Yeah. So his obviously John Brown was a Calvinist, so he could be very severe in a lot of areas, because like Calvinism, very big on predestination, very big on like God's total like authority over the entire world, and that humans are essentially helpless in the power of God. Like when you read some of his like things he wrote like while he was in prison, he's like, this God predestined this shit when he like created the earth, so I'm not upset about it. So just like that sort of stuff. But he's like, where it kind of comes from, his commitment to social justice as a Christian, is he was very big on the golden rule. Like he mentions that in his trial, in his final speech before the court. And the golden rule, obviously, treat other people as you want to be treated. He was heavily raised with that. And I think that's like a line that kind of comes up for him a lot. Just like the whole, like I mentioned, respecter of persons is also a big thing. And I would also say one of the most important lines to him, and again, he mentions it in his final speech before the trial, is remember those in bonds as bound with them. So I think just that ultimate, like his like solidarity with other people comes from his religious interpretation, as like these are all beings created lovingly by God, and that God didn't like create anybody to be above anybody else, so why should I? It's like, how is my judgment better than God's? It's kind of like how I think he would interpret it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Beautiful. But yeah, go on, and you can talk about others now. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, cool. I already mentioned St. Basil, who I love. He was one of the, he was from Cappadocia, or no, Caesarea, he lived under the Roman Empire, but he created something called the Basiliad, which was where there was a great famine that happened in his area, in his region. And basically, like, he created the Basiliad as like a house of hospitality where people could come and get food, clothing, sometimes shelter, but also a big emphasis on like religious practice, but also like education and kind of raising consciousness too, like just having like shops where I know people could like read and have like religious services and kind of be not only nourished in the physical sense, but also in the spiritual sense. And he also would, some of his best writings, there's a popular patristics book with his like writings on social justice, and he has a lot of bars going after the wealthy and how they're like greedy and not giving to the poor, and it's really great. So I recommend checking out St. Basil. Super awesome. Then another one of my favorite people in history is Gerard Winstanley, who I know people are familiar with the Diggers during the English Civil War, English like Revolution, whatever. In like 1649, they like established they basically England. I don't know how England's like land tenure system works, but they would go on commons, the common lands, and just start like growing stuff and be like, we're gonna live here because we like got thrown out of like off our land and are poor and don't have anything else to do, so we're just gonna like grow food on the common land and live here as a community. And he his big thing, and what I really like about him, is he considered the earth as common. He says the earth was created by God as a common treasury without respect to persons. So again, going back to that respect to persons, so that everyone should have a perfectly good right to seek their livelihood and their subsistence from the earth, and that no one should have the right to like buy and sell land. He mentions that God didn't create, and when God created the earth, he didn't like appoint certain people as landlords and other people as like tenants. He just created the earth as something common. So for me, that's like a big part, just like thinking about like land and how like land ownership and how like obviously that is basically a major process for capitalism. Because what's interesting about Winstanley is that he's living at a time when capitalism is kind of emerging. People are beginning to get kicked off of their like ancestral lands and having to move to cities to work or have work as agricultural laborers, and just like seeing kind of a religious reflection of that is super interesting. I just want to mention a couple more people.
Sure.
We got like the Berrigan brothers, who I love, who are also super cool. They were Jesuits. They're part of the Plowshares movement, which I'll bring up kind of later when we talk a little more about like militarism. But they're big like leaders in the Plowshares movement, and did like were some of the people like responsible for like they would basically take draft files and burn them. In one case, they like in the Catonsville case, I believe it was, they stole draft files from a draft office and burned them using like homemade napalm. And what they had figured out was that if you burn the draft files, that's the only way they would be able to track these people. So that means they couldn't draft the guys that they're going after. So yeah, the Berrigan brothers, cool guys, Daniel and Phil Berrigan, and then just like the whole milieu around them of that Catholic left. In like the 60s, 70s, like against the war in Vietnam, just like a lot of activism came out of that. Then I'm just gonna name drop some people for people to like look into, because I be like Ernesto Cardenal. Well, all right, I'll give a little more about Ernesto Cardenal.
Yeah,
also one of my favorites. He was another Jesuit priest. I think he was Jesuit. Maybe I'm not. He was whatever. He was diocesan. Doesn't matter. He was a priest in a little town, or like very rural town in Nicaragua called Santaname, where they established like base communities. A big part of like my inspiration for me is liberation theology and like the base communities, because the whole idea behind that was that the oppressed can form their own theology. They can like read the Bible and interpret it and apply it to their daily lives. And Cardinal was really big on that. He released a couple books called The Gospel in Santaname, which is like a recording of a lot of these conversations with like the peasants that live there, and they're awesome, super interesting to see like what people have to say and what they think about their faith. And Cardinal worked closely with the Sandinistas and actually ended up being part of the government after the revolution. So it's awesome. So I love Ernesto Cardinal, cool guy. And then when I would also be bad to not mention Saint Francis, who I already mentioned, but Saint Francis, his that whole idea of like same thing, like living in voluntary poverty and in service to the poor, and also his ideas on ecology. So he was very big on caring for the environment and particularly caring for animals. So in the church, St. Francis Day is like a day where people bring their like pets to the church to get like blessed and stuff, which I think is super cool. But also just like the idea of like kind of creating the earth as like something that we live with as like companions. We don't like dominate the earth. We live as companions with other creatures and other things on the planet. So yeah. And then couple of people I just want to mention, just I'll shout them out. So people don't think I'm just listing dudes. There's like Fanny Lou Hamer, who's super great. She was very inspired by her religious belief, and she was active in the civil rights movement, also very active in like education. Dolores Williams has a lot of interesting writing about theology. And then this is a man, but James Cone, who was the author of the Black Theology of Liberation, which is a very good book. And he was, very big on like kind of continuing the conversation, taking liberation theology out of Latin America and applying it to the Black context in America. So yeah, those are just a small list of some of my inspirations. And I guess in terms of politics, the normal ones like obviously like Lenin, Mao, all those guys, and then other people like that. So
absolutely. Yeah, no, I love all that. There's I'm interested also in like mysticism, and this isn't really about liberation theology, but it is a part of the Catholic tradition, especially in medieval Europe, where you had many women mystics that I'm reading a book right now called Mysticism by Simon Crowley, which is just this, mysticism in this Catholic sense is this total, radical, intimate unity with God, this complete transcendence and obliteration of self into God. It's a spiritual act. It's a divine union. And if people are interested in learning about that history and the many women mystics throughout Catholic history, I would recommend that book. It's also a philosophical explainer of mysticism, which can be very difficult to find your way into if you're not really already knowledgeable about what it is. It's very obscure, but so many great people, and St. Francis in particular. You mentioned his ecology, his reference to himself as the brother to all creation, not even just animals, but saw himself as a sibling of the sun and the moon and the trees and the water. And it's a really radical orientation that, as you said, sees the earth as a living, breathing companion and a part of the big self, a part of this gorgeous gift from God. And St. Francis' relationship to it is always inspiring. I have many St. Francis statues around my house for that reason. He's one of my favorite religious figures in history. I have episodes as well, if people want to dive deeper on this. I have episodes on John Brown, on St. Francis, on the actual material life of Jesus Christ. I'll link to those in the show notes so people can follow up on some of these figures. And I certainly want to do episodes on like Ernesto Cardinal and others in the future as well. So that's really great. And another figure I just want to quickly mention that was a huge impact on me is, and we talked about this before we recorded, is Thomas Merton, who is, sort of socially engaged, progressive Christian during the civil rights movement, but also had a deep, intimate, and sincere relationship and engagement with Buddhism, and sort of brought in Buddhist practices and Zen practices of meditation into his Christian faith. And I remember I came across a book randomly. I didn't even know who he was yet when I was like 19 years old. The Thomas Merton book, No Man is an Island, where it's just these essays of spiritual reflections. And so much of it is about this other-orientedness, this ego transcendence. And it's very resonant with Buddhist ideals, but it's framed within Christian language. And I found it very beautiful and meaningful and spiritually impactful for me at that age. So people can look into him if they're also interested in that. But you did mention. Go ahead. Yeah, if you have anything.
So him and Cardinal were friends too.
Oh, cool.
He's like one of the people that encouraged Cardinal to go to Latin America.
Nice, lots of connections. All right, but yeah, you did mention militarism, and I want to kind of address this aspect of it because many mainstream American churches, Catholic and Protestant, are deeply entangled with nationalism, capitalism, and even militarism. how do you make sense of those contradictions, and kind of how do you respond to them as a Christian within Christian community?
Yeah, so I wanted to actually go give a quote from Frederick Douglass to this because I thought worked well. So he said, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. So my whole thing is I don't like, a lot of times you'll get people that will say that it's kind of like the same thing we have in like communist circles. Will be like, well, they're not real Christians because they don't agree with me on these things. And I'm like, well, that's it's too bad because like these people identify as Christian and they come from an interpretation of the Christian religion, so you can't just say they're not Christian. I mean, I'll do it occasionally. I'll call them like false Christians or something as just to piss them off, but like not. I think that's just a very easy like get out of not a kind of an easy cop out or like get out of jail free card to just say, oh, these people just don't actually represent Christianity, and I think that's kind of like not a good. I don't think that's a very good approach to it. I think it is a better approach is to be like, yeah, these people are part of Christianity, and that's just a bad thing, and we kind of need to be working towards trying to change them. Like we need to, as a leftist or communist Christian, I need to be take that responsibility onto myself to like try and change that about the Christian faith. Is that we need to be reaching, you don't have to like, go to like some sort of like revival or something and get yourself beat up, but like you do like should be like talking to these people and wherever you can, trying to like change their, trying to raise their consciousness or get them away from these sort of like reactionary beliefs. And that's like a big thing that I noticed with like particularly like younger Christians. Like the Catholic Church is seeing a lot of particularly like, younger men coming to the church because they like view it as like this all super traditional and like all of this like they like the aesthetic and that sort of stuff. And oftentimes they're pretty reactionary. And I think as like leftist Christians, we need to be kind of like working against that, trying to draw those guys who are kind of opening them up to the church and like a way more towards like hopefully a better understanding of Christianity and like what like trying to identify and like live like the original Christian community was. So that's like a big part of it. So you have like, and that's a big like theme that appears in like particular like liberation theology is it's talking about like the Church of Christ and then the Church of Constantine. So like I'm sure most people kind of know is that Constantine, the Roman emperor, he supposed the stories he sees I think he has like a vision of a cross, and he pledges that if God helps him win this battle, he'll convert to Christianity. He naturally wins the battle and converts to Christianity and converts the whole empire supposedly to Christianity. And for most people, for a lot of like the institutional church, what that meant was taking what was originally kind of a subversive religion that like opposed like wealth and like lived as a community, and taking that and accommodating it to being kind of in service of empire. And I think that's still kind of something we obviously see today, is that's kind of like a big through line from that time to now, is that the church essentially at the time got co-opted by power as like basically to serve power. And then, but you also have another strand that I think it still has been present in the church throughout its whole history, even from that time, that is kind of like what we'll call like the Church of Christ, where it is still kind of trying to imitate the original like Christian community, where I can't remember, some ancient Greek philosopher said like the way you can tell Christians apart from other people is by the way they love one another. And like, so a lot of people, there's still like that strand of the church throughout the entire history of the church that still tries to imitate the original Christian community, and like their approach to like living communally and like loving one another and being kind of subversive and resisting power. And like once you like learning about like even the history of like Europe, oftentimes we kind of the idea that we think a lot of times think this in Marxist circles too, is that like religion kind of purely served as a way to make people docile and not challenge the existing order. But like when you actually go back and like look through the history, most like rebellions or like uprisings or something that happened in like medieval Europe or other places were like religiously inspired. Like the peasants' revolt in England in like the 1300s was in large part was inspired by religion. Like the one of the leaders was a priest named John Ball, and like similar thing with like the diggers during the English Revolution. They were obviously religiously inspired, and it kind of goes that way, you know, throughout history. Is that people, the poor, the oppressed, have like always had their own ways of how they experience and interact with faith. It hasn't always just been something that's like been imposed from above, and they've always had like their own way to interpret and implement faith in their life. So I think that's like kind of something that I always like want to emphasize, that there's always been like these sorts of like liberatory strands in Christianity. And then, you know, today we still have similar problems. Like I said, Douglas's quote, he's saying that like, you know, there's very clearly like two different types of Christianity. One that's like more liberatory, you know, that's not. And it kind of reminds me of like during the Vietnam War, when I mentioned the Berrigan brothers, one of the greatest promoters of the Vietnam War was Cardinal Spellman, who ironically I think it was J. Edgar Hoover referred to him as the most notorious homosexual in all of New York City, or something like that. Just a funny quote about him. But Cardinal Spellman was a huge booster of the Vietnam War. He was it's sometimes even called Spellman's War. And if you hang around New York City enough, you're going to definitely come across like things named after Cardinal Spellman, like there's a Cardinal Spellman High School, which I think is pretty whack. But so he was big. But then you also have the Berrigan brothers and Dorothy, like and Dorothy Day, like the because like, you know, the Catholic worker obviously is very focused on focused on like peace movements and like resisting war. And Cardinal Spellman really hated Dorothy, and he really hated the Berrigan brothers. So it's like that kind of divide. And it's like I also think about that in terms of slavery. Like one of the in the history of the United States in terms of like slavery is that when you go back and look at the history, there's a book called White Too Long. I forget who it's by, but it just kind of explains how the church not only played a part in like maintaining slavery, but also built like an entire theology around justifying it. And one of the major denominations that was kind of responsible for that was Southern Baptists. But the irony is that like while the Southern Baptists, the major mainstream Southern Baptist church, said that, Nat Turner himself was a Baptist. So it's like you have these, even within the same denomination of people, you can have like very widely varying takes on society and how it's supposed to work. So, you know, you have Cardinal Spellman, you have the Berrigan brothers, you have like racist, slave loving pastors in Alabama and Virginia, and then you have Nat Turner in Virginia too. And then even like today, you know, the church I think has gotten a lot better about its stance on like militarism. Like Pope Francis was pretty big on emphasizing peace, and Leo is kind of like continued in that strain. But even then, like the people that are involved in all of these religions have a wide array of beliefs. So like here at the Catholic Worker in New York City, some of our members and, you know, other people that were part of they did like the plowshares movements. So like one of the guys I live with was part of the Kings Bay plowshare movement, plowshare action, where they broke into the Kings Bay base in Georgia, which is like a nuclear submarine base, and like symbolically deactivated the nuclear weapons. They like threw their own blood on on some stuff there, and you know, kind of vandalized a little bit of the base, which is a major theme in anti-war Catholic actions, is throwing your blood on stuff, which I think is kind of cool. But it's a very metal form of protest. And then not just the Kings Bay, there's also like Jessica Resnicek, who I don't know if and Ruby Montoya. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with them, but they were arrested and convicted for vandalizing. I think it was the Dakota Access Pipeline. I might be wrong. One of the pipelines that I think that was big in like the 2010s. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of activism around. I can't remember exactly which one, but they were arrested for sabotaging and those pipelines. And Jessica Resnicek was a Catholic worker. I don't remember. I forget which community she was in, but yeah, she was a Catholic worker. And then finally, I want to bring up one other group that kind of shows its like kind of differences, that like throughout the 70s and 80s, we had the sanctuary movement. So this was largely based around El Salvador. And I forgot, person I forgot to mention in my inspirations, Oscar Romero, Saint Romero from El Salvador. Y'all just look into him. He's very famous. He's super cool. But the sanctuary movement largely popped up around immigration from El Salvador, while the U.S. was funding, like, the dictators and stuff there and the military there to, like, just kill peasants. So a lot of people were fleeing to the United States from Central America. And the sanctuary movement was churches basically opening up their doors and saying, y'all can come stay here, and then claiming kind of like this ancient right of sanctuary that cops and ICE and at the time INS couldn't come in and arrest these people. They claimed that the church was a sanctuary and you can't arrest people in the sanctuary. So, and that movement is hopefully getting revived a little bit today. There's still some churches out there that are declaring themselves sanctuaries, which I think is cool. So yeah, that's like, I mean, just in terms of like, active, like currently stuff going on, like undermining the police state we have today. So
yeah, I love that emphasis on these different strains, that, it's not one thing. The Christian religion, the Catholic Church, it's not just the Church of Constantine. It's not just the Church of Power and Empire. There's always been, and there still is, this organic counter process within that evolution, fighting against that every step of the way. And that's what needs to be emphasized. And when you just see it as one thing, when you just take those two processes and chop them in half and only emphasize the one, you do a real disservice to all the people and movements, past and present, that are fighting from within the Christian tradition against these very forces, and doing so in a lot of cases incredibly effectively. But I also wanted to mention, you said the Dakota Access Pipeline, and I think the one you might have been talking about was the Keystone XL pipeline. And I remember that because it cut straight through Nebraska, so it was a huge local issue for us here as well. So that's really cool to hear about that history. I had no idea that they did that. But yeah, and you mentioned the trad sort of.
And can I just?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I just want to cut in there. Just to mention that Jessica Resnicek, I think Ruby Montoya are still in prison. They were convicted to, like, I think since like more than 8 years, even though they supposedly took a plea deal that would lower it down, but they kind of got tricked and were charged with terrorism. So they're still in jail. You can write their places on the internet where you can like write to Jessica while she's in jail. So just look into her and see how you can help her out. I'm just gonna put that out there.
Yeah, that's really important, and I'll look into that as well. And if I can find a link for maybe an organization that directly supports them, or some way that people can access and write to them, that'd be wonderful thing to help. But I just wanted to quickly touch on that trad aspect, because there is on the reactionary right this sort of refascination with religion, this attempt to become trad, which is really just this sort of nostalgic attempt to recreate in the postmodern world a sort of sincere religious practice that I think is inherently inauthentic, because it's not rooted in the deepest values of Christianity. It's rooted in this reactionary nostalgia for the cultural accoutrements of a previous Christianity, mainly like, patriarchy and the subordination of the wife in the home, and all of this stuff that speaks to an insecure masculinity in an era of neoliberalism. So it really is a grotesque development. But as this influx of reactionary young men come into the church, we would love to hope that there are people and institutions that are aware of it and ready to act against it with compassion. But quickly, before we move on, what are your thoughts on the new pope?
Leo, cool. I like him for the most part. I think he's obviously like a continuation pick. Like, he's supposed to be like kind of a continuation of like Pope Francis and some of the reforms he began to make. So I think in that way, definitely like him. I mean, there are obviously plenty of things to criticize about him, because he's the head of the Catholic Church, which like kind of obviously puts like obvious limitations on what he can say. Which, whatever. I'm not trying to make excuses for him, because he has been like pretty open in making statements that are like very obviously about Israel, which is good. But I would prefer that he actually just says it, like says, I'm talking about Israel right now and they're killing people and it's wrong. But I like that. And also he just did a mass dedicated to the care of creation. So very clearly he's trying to continue on the same path with Francis in terms of like his ecology. So like Francis, big thing, he published Laudate Si, which was like a big encyclical. I'm not sure what it was, writing about ecology and like taking care of the earth, and he was like telling people y'all are fucking up and we need to make things better. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways Leo is hopefully is positive and hopefully going to be taking things in the correct direction. I hope I'm in just a better direction, not because like the other thing, the other balance in the church, and you can see this if you watch Conclave, is that there's like basically this other, like you said, trad part in the church that are like trying to take us back to like pre-Vatican II, which if y'all don't know what that is, it's like a church council where that's where like a lot of, they basically want to bring us back to just like Latin masses and stuff. And I don't want that. So at least in that sense, Leo is definitely good because he's not going to do that, at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, an imperfect organization and institution for sure, and you can only expect so much from somebody like that. But I do like the turn to Francis and then the continuation through Leo. It does seem to be pretty progressive for what the institutionalized church can offer. So there's reason for hope for sure. So a couple more questions, and we'll wrap this discussion up. Do you see space for a realignment or a reawakening within American Christianity? Or do you think the institutional church has become too compromised by empire? Or do you think American Christianity has been too fragmented by its various denominations to ever have a coherent, like a singular awakening or anything like that? Like what do you see as the future of American Christianity?
Yeah, that one's interesting because it can be very easy to be super doomer about the current like status of like Christianity in the country, because really the majority of Christians in our country are, kind of Christo-fascists and, very much like basically, they think that having grown up in like an area where it's pretty prevalent, like the whole, like we've got a disturbing amount of people who think that the apocalypse is coming and like, Trump's going to usher it in or some, just stuff like that. Like weird, like revelations that are just super reactionary. And yeah, it's difficult to imagine how, you're going to take that and change it. I just think for me, I think it's not necessarily, we don't need to get like the whole institutional church on board. That's not like, because that's probably just not going to happen, particularly in America and, even with the Catholic Church. I think it's a matter of Christians, like leftist Christians, a liberatory Christianity can be part and can contribute to a larger revolutionary process or like a larger like mass movement. Is that it doesn't have to be something, and I think that's important for a lot of Christians to realize, is that it's we're obviously not going to be, we're probably not going to be the ones that like lead it, and that's good. That's probably a good thing, but we can contribute to it in the ways that we can. And part of that is like can be through our faith, through reaching out to people to Christians who would be open to like a more liberatory understanding of Christianity. But also, in terms of like the church, I think most importantly, I'm an advocate in the Catholic Church of like greater power for the laity and moving a little bit more away from like the hierarchy. And I think that's how we get like change in the church is usually through like bottom up actions and organizing with members of the laity to try and like make their voices heard in the church and push for those changes. So yeah, I think that's kind of like my approach to it, is that we're probably not going to get the whole institutional church on board, but we can get other people that can contribute to a larger mass movement and be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the phrase Christo-fascist, it's a very real social phenomenon, but it's so unfortunate and so oxymoronic to its absolute core that you could combine the name and message of Jesus Christ with the political movement that is fascism. Those are two, diametrically opposed words and meanings, but of course it's a very real thing. And as I've always said, every religion has a political spectrum. Every single religion, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, have a radical revolutionary liberatory left, an accommodationist center, and a reactionary right. And so, it's not unique to any one religion, and it's about combating the center and the right from a liberatory left-wing perspective, and drawing on the very real traditions within every single religion that advance those core values that we believe in. And I don't know who said it, maybe you do, but the quote that the real Christians are the communists, that can be taken too far, of course, but I think I think it gets at something very real. And on the flip side of that, Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of Christianity was also his critique of socialism, right? It's too egalitarian. It believes in equality, and Nietzsche's coming from this perspective of Übermenschen versus the herd, this reactionary, aristocratic politic that was disdainful of what he saw as present in both Christianity and socialism. But for me, that's a point of pride. Like, yeah, Nietzsche, you were right. There's something beautifully true in both Christianity and communism, a radical egalitarianism that we aim to continue to develop in the face of reactionary politics like the ones advanced by Nietzsche and still carried forward to some extent today, which is, the Nietzschean right are very anti-communist, anti-socialist, and anti-Christian, right? They're hostile to all of these things because of the egalitarian core which exists within them. So there's a real space for us to, for Christians on the left to reclaim at least that beautiful tradition that you've been pointing out, Alex, that's always been present within the Christian tradition, and all these figures throughout, going all the way back to Jesus, whose messages were clearly more aligned with egalitarian, social justice-oriented political movements instead of brutal capitalist, militaristic, consumerist forms of the church that, or the religion that have been manifested today superstructurally. So as we wrap this up, I first want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing, your experiences, your journey, your wisdom and knowledge. I hope there are people listening that find inspiration in this conversation and can find new figures and writers and thinkers and historical people that they can turn to, learn more about, draw inspiration from. I really encourage everybody to follow your page, which of course I'll link to in the show notes. And as we wrap up here, do you have any last words you want to say, and anything you want to promote, or any place you want to point people towards where they can find you and your work online?
Yeah, so I did, there's one thing I just wanted to hit on before, and it's kind of about the relationship between like Christianity and potential like with revolutionary movements. It's like talking about like historically, I think there's like a lot of baggage there. When it comes to like how Christianity has interacted with like more like socialist and anarchist and communist movements. And one thing I get really annoyed with people about in the church is when they talk about like how like revolutions like kind of targeted the church, and sometimes, and I'm like, well, those I would say like those ass whoopings didn't fall from the sky. Like they didn't like just come out of nowhere. They were like basically they're part of like a long tradition of the church upholding oppressive structures, at least in the hierarchy, upholding oppressive structures. And that's where like a lot of resentment and wrath ultimately came from. And I think it's important to understand, though, that the church and most churches and most religions are kind of like little microcosms of the societies they're in. So like one example I always go to is like the French Revolution. When you look at like when we talk about the French Revolution, we kind of talk about the three estates, especially like the first estate being the clergy, and kind of talking about they're like this united kind of like front that like had no disagreements. But in reality, when you get down to it, like a lot of the priests and stuff that like priests on the parish level actually supported the revolution, and they generally supported and sided with the third estate because ultimately they were from the third estate. That's where they came from. Like that, in a lot of cases, that's the same thing with like parish priests today. They come from like the common people. But then you have like the hierarchy that were like obviously more aligned with like the king. So I think it's like important to realize that within the church, like I've already been pointing out, there's a whole like array of like opinions, and I also think it's important to know to be kind of like a member of, like I say, like being a member of the church in reality, or by even being a member of the communist movements in reality, because like particularly in the church, like a lot of people will be like, you need to believe this, and this in order to be like a Catholic. And I'm just like, well, I need to do all these things. And my opinion is like, if you go into a church, 99 out of 100 people there are breaking the church's rules in some way or another. Like, and it's not like really about like this idea of saying like, oh, you're not a real Christian because you don't agree with this certain thing, this certain doctrine. It's well, you'll be surprised to find that like, there are a lot of people that no matter how you work it out theoretically, they can like still identify as both like a communist and a Christian. And that's just like the reality of it. And there's thousands of people that do that every day and like have that like influence their lives. So these kind of like theoretical discussions of like saying like you can't be both a Christian and a Marxist, or you can't be both a Marxist and a Christian, like they are kind of, to me, just kind of pointless, because, well, the reality is that there are people that are Marxists and Christians, and there are people that are anarchists and Christians, and because that's just how like people and their like identities work. So those are the things I just wanted to hit on. That is that just like all of these things, these things can like work together and be in dialogue and with each other. And like finally, just like you asked about like where people can find me, I'd recommend just my Instagram account, Southern Catholic Worker. Also subscribe to the Catholic Worker newspaper. And if you're ever in New York City, I live at 36 East First Street, St. Joseph House. You can come on by, volunteer, talk whatever you want to talk about. I'll be here most likely. So yeah, those are the main ways.
Hell yeah. Very, very cool. Very awesome. Yeah, Leo Tolstoy jumps to mind when you mentioned Christian anarchism. I got to give him a shout out. And I just wanted to touch on one quick thing. I'll link to all that in the show notes as well. But you mentioned the conflict historically between Christianity and the revolutionary left. We saw it in the Spanish Civil War, incredibly strongly with the Catholic Francoist government and the revolutionaries going to war with the clergy in so many instances. And also theoretically, we see it in Marx and Engels and Lenin, which is this sort of advancement of atheism. And what I want to say there is that they themselves were part of a broader historical materialist development coming out of the Enlightenment and reacting righteously and correctly to what you alluded to, Alex, which was this institutionalized force that was very conservative, was very reactionary, was part and parcel with the very power structures that their movements were seeking to overthrow. But as we've moved forward in history, especially in sort of secular West, the religious institutions have become weakened, and while there still is some engagement with power on some level, there's much less, and the broad orientation of our societies is a desacralized, secular consumerism that has largely done away with religion. And so now there's a dialectical spiral where we've overcome, as we had to through the Enlightenment, the religious superstitions and stupid rigid hierarchies of the past. We've come through the scientific period of enlightenment. We've embraced atheism. We've used atheism as the hammer to deconstruct much of the harmful superstitions and rigid social hierarchies. Now we live in a sort of spiritual wasteland of consumerism, and what we're doing now dialectically and historically is we are returning to and reclaiming spirituality and the religious impulse at a higher level, because the religious impulse is just the human condition. There's always going to be a deep yearning within the human mind and the human heart to relate to infinity and eternity and the mystery and majesty of the cosmos and of life itself. There's always going to be an element of our being that wants to engage with and explore that dimension of our lives, and it's never just going to go away once and for all. So we can learn from and understand why those conflicts happened historically without copying and pasting them to our current situation, which is fundamentally different. And so, part of my goal and part of yours, whether it's explicit or implicit, is to reintroduce the spiritual and religious impulses, hopefully at a higher level, emphasizing their liberatory potential and emphasizing them as ways of relating not just to politics and economics in the social realm, but to the very human condition of life and death and mystery and majesty that we find ourselves in. And so I think that we both have that sort of implicit goal in both of our works, and so that's why I've always appreciated what you do, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of that with us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for
for listening. Rev Left Radio is 100% listener funded. If you like what we do here, you can support us at patreon.com/Rev Left Radio or make a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/Rev Left Radio. Links will be in the show notes.